Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Blessed Man Meditations is where we provide answers to the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide an answer for the hope that's in them according to 1 Peter 3:15. Atheism Dead, the book we're going through currently, is written by Metaxas. Metaxas is a best-selling author. His book has been translated into 25 languages. He hosts a nationally syndicated radio show and an acclaimed conversation series named Socrates in the City. He's a prominent cultural commentator whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Wall Street Journal. So he is a reputable source. Metaxas has written an article about the scientific evidence for the existence of God. This book goes into some detail about some of that evidence in earlier chapters. Today we continue our look at Is Atheism Dead by Metaxas, part 3 of the book, What is Truth? Chapter 19, the Four Horsemen, where we're going to meet the four famous atheists of the 21st century. They are Richard Dawkins, Dennett, Sam Harris, and the late Christopher Hitchens. In answering the question posed by this book's title, Is Atheism Dead?, one cannot avoid some mention of the so-called new atheists, who burst onto the cultural scene some 15 years ago. 2006. This book was published in 2021, so 15 years ago at the time of the publishing of this book. But these guys, lately, around the time that Metaxas had published his book, had been mostly quiet. But their rancorous campaign against religion for some years is the most recent expression of atheism in Western culture, such that many who today call themselves atheists have the principal figures of this movement to thank, namely Richard Dawkins, Dennett, Sam Harris, and the late Christopher Hitchens, who sometimes styled themselves the Four Horsemen of the new atheism. What marked their movement was the exuberance and fury with which they condemned religious faith, for they were not content merely to maintain God's non-existence. On the contrary, they rather energetically denounced all religious expressions as irrational and somehow anti-science, and therefore intolerably vile and imminently dangerous, and in need of forceful eradication by whatever means available, whatever that might mean. But their arguments have not stood up well, which will perhaps surprise anyone who recalls the showering sparks and billowing smoke that attended their cantankerous eruptions in many books and debates through which they glowered steadfastly and unpleasantly, as though smiling might be taken as unseriousness. But how were they so well received by many of the cultural mandarins who gave them the many opportunities to make their case? For a clue, we may turn to their books, which were such impressive bestsellers that at the height of their popularity one felt a responsibility to see what all the fuss was about, if only to become familiar with the accusations being put forth. In a world full of people longing for answers to the ultimate questions about meaning and transcendence, those of us who present the God of the Bible as the answer to such questions should certainly try to understand the views of the other side of things. For the longest time, I was afraid to do that. I was afraid to investigate the views of the other side because I was afraid that I would have my mind changed, and I didn't want to have my mind changed. And there are people who grow up in a religious Christian worldview, who, and I'm sure it could be a different religious worldview, Muslim, for instance, Buddhist, for instance, and there are many people who investigate the evidence for their religion, and they become disenchanted with their religion. They become unconvinced by their religion, and they reject it, and some become atheists. And they in part of their journey, they will investigate the views of the other religions and the views of atheism. And some will become convinced, some have become convinced that the God of the Bible is not real, and no gods are in fact real, and they would become convinced that atheism is the way to go, and they would follow in the footsteps of people like Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens. But that's the beautiful thing about this book, Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. It really, he spends the first 2/3 of this book presenting the evidence for God's existence from science, from archaeology, and then he goes and now he's going through the part where he talks about the problems of the atheistic worldview. And surely, those in the culture not having any particular point of view were interested in understanding what these highly educated and mostly well-spoken fellows might be saying, and were therefore only too happy to oblige them and see what they might have to say. So somebody who is not having any particular point of view, they're not really sure or not really caring whether or not God exists. You might call them agnostic. So, it was in a similarly well-intentioned effort that Metaxas located a copy of the most famous of their books, that by Christopher Hitchens, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. If you listen to Hitchens' debate, since he died of cancer, I forget how many years ago now, it might say in this book, I don't remember, but he is a very Dawkins and Hitchens are very articulate men who can make their points very well, but there are just some things that they're missing that Metaxas is going to bring out. So Hitchens wrote the book God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. Okay, surely Metaxas must learn something from Hitchens' book, even if he disagreed with its premise and thought its title was childishly silly and trivial. Puerile. As Metaxas settled down to read Hitchens' book, Metaxas deliberately ignored the title. Hitchens was prone to be deliberately provocative, and one assumed the title was an especially pointed example of Hitchens being provocative. Was Hitchens trying to draw attention to his book by giving it that provocative title, but even Metaxas plunged ahead into the thicket of Hitchens' sentences. Even as Metaxas got into reading Hitchens' book, Metaxas became very quickly but surely mystified. Metaxas found that he couldn't make any real sense of what he discovered. Metaxas understood the sentences Hitchens wrote. Metaxas couldn't understand how such a popular book by someone so previously brilliant could be so aggressively and ambitiously awful. That's what Metaxas said about Hitchens' book. It was easy to see how such a book could be popular. It was popular because it used unconnected anecdotes and mean-spirited hyperbole and witticisms to confirm and further inflame the deep emotional animus many readers felt toward religion of some kind or of any kind at all. And I can relate to that characterization because I have heard the mean-spirited hyperbole coming forth from the mouths of atheists that I know personally or that I hear on the internet. But the book so unconscionably elided the sharp differences between religions that it was eventually embarrassing for Metaxas to read until Metaxas could no longer continue and simply had to look away permanently. But how could someone like Hitchens possibly be so confused? It was a conundrum. Nonetheless, for anyone hoping to learn something about the sincere views of these atheists, the book proved not merely to be the proverbial tough sledding, but it was really more like trying to sled uphill in August. Not going to happen. He couldn't read it. Metaxas tried to continue reading Hitchens' book, but the more Metaxas read, the more the book became disappointing, incoherent, least logical, and least enticing to Metaxas. Metaxas knew he was listening to a master rhetorician, speaking to an audience he must have regarded as beneath him, and who was obviously taking advantage of this inequity by being so intellectually sloppy and discursive that those of us who knew what he was capable of as a writer and thinker were embarrassed, and not just for Hitchens, but for his publisher too, and for anyone in the general neighborhood of the factory where the books were printed. Still, what could account for this discursive intellectual slumming, if anything could, and for this unfortunate swan dive gutterward? Did Hitchens simply find himself needing money, and know that with some Scotch fuel he could easily rant with faux profundity on the subject for pages and pages, and that withering tone for which he was famous, like a thundering British admiral dressing down his men, blasting a sitting seabird out of the water with his blunderbuss as he fulminated before finally staggering back to his stateroom for more grog? Metaxas uses some very vivid words. Or was Hitchens himself so emotional on this issue that he was really unable to see himself, or was unable to unflare his nostrils to cool his temper long enough ever to get a hold of himself and say something worth saying? It was baffling to Metaxas. Surely Hitchens could make some real points on this worthy subject instead of taking potshots so wild and cheap that it defied understanding and surely made him plummet in the eyes of not a few previous admirers. How could someone so incisive on other subjects be so patently obtuse on this, unless it was the purest mercenariness unimaginable, or something else equally awful, like someone you can see becoming angrier and angrier as they talk, finally betraying themselves by saying things they no longer have the power not to say, thereby giving the listener a hideous x-ray of their unaccountably wounded psyche. In any case, Metaxas must beg the reader's pardon, and here confess that after thinking this over for some time, Metaxas was very sure he had no idea. Evidently, some things must be kept at arm's length and goggled at, whose greasy clogs refuse to be plumbed. As Metaxas has already intimated, what struck especially in Mr. Hitchens' book was the excruciating absence of serious argument, and the concomitant tangled bird's nest of various self-contradictions. What was even less escapable was the corrosive and almost frightening anger that seemed to drive it all. As it happened, it was this anger that most of the new atheists had in common, the smoking thread that seemed sinuously to snake its way through everything, sometimes taking a sinister and dark form, but more often an adolescent form, as though this perpetually seething quartet, Dawkins, Dennett, Harris, and Hitchens, were each stuck in a take-no-prisoners effort to obliterate someone who had sadistically abused them long before they had the ability to fight back. It's like they had some personal vendetta they were fighting. For what else could explain it? Why else would they be acting this way? Points were often made with unpleasantly generous portions of swagger and sneer, and sometimes upper-class snobbery, too, clearly meant to belittle their less ostentatiously educated opponents. Yeah, I get that when I listen to people like Hitchens speak or Harris speak. There was one debate between Dawkins and a Christian. It might have been William Lane Craig. I can't remember right now, but the thing that stuck out about that debate is that Dawkins and the Christian were so respectful of each other. They were so, they were great. It was the best debate that I've heard, and Dawkins was on the atheistic side. And it was great because they each represented their sides very well, and they were very respectful of each other. That unpleasant swagger and sneer and snobbery and belittling didn't happen. from either side, and it was really a pleasant one to hear. I don't remember who the Christian was. I remember that it was Dawkins on the atheist side. It was probably wittingly Craig, but it's just my guess. With Hitchens, there could be genuine wit, but with many others, there were often fatiguing cliches, such as, well, you don't believe in Zeus or Osiris or Thor or Garnished, do you? I just go one god farther than you. I think I've heard Hitchens say that. I don't believe in your God, the God of the Bible. If they had punctuated these ripostes with an outthrust tongue and the declaration, so there, it might have nicely underscored the schoolyard effect. Yeah, Metaxas is saying they're sounding like, I guess he's saying they're sounding a little bit like bratty schoolboys. When they committed similar sentiments to print, God was often spelled with a lowercase g, as though this were especially edgy in a way that shaped poems were thought to be in the 1960s. Of course, what went along with this was the noticeable lack of humility or grace toward those with whom they disagreed, and they usually seemed much less interested in actually convincing their opponents than in scoring points with the audience members already on their side. Yes, and I've heard William Craig say, when he is debating somebody, he, the Christian, Craig, his primary goal isn't for the debater to convince the debater to change their mind, his opponent to change their mind. Craig's goal is primarily to reach the audience. So there was an untoward lack of respect toward those who thought differently, and a generally dehumanizing tone garnished now and again with moments of outrage. There are times when I felt like I've been on the receiving end of that lack of respect, and on the receiving end of the dehumanizing tone, the receiving end of the outrage. How could I believe in a God that justifies slavery or justifies misogyny or some of these other things that Paul Copan answers in his book, Is God a Moral Monster? And it's just interesting because there are some atheists out there, you can present them with the facts and you can present them with the response to show them that their view is just wrong. Not just because I say it's wrong, but just because it's based on a misunderstanding and a misinterpretation of the biblical text. But they're not going to change. Their minds are made up. We can still pray for them, and we can continue to share the truth and love with them. Again, why? Most people interested in the big questions about life and meaning and truth are genuinely interested in hearing arguments they can understand or think about and perhaps learn from. Any mature adult with a reasonable level of self-esteem should hardly become furious to the point of empurplement over those putting forth different ideas. But some of the new atheists do, and I have done that in some of my earlier days. I think I dishonored Christ in some of my exchanges with certain atheists. But I've learned, and resources like this from Metaxas can help educate the Christians to defend their faith. Let's see. And any mature adult with a reasonable level of self-esteem should hardly become furious to the point of empurplement over those putting forth different ideas, but somehow the bristling emotions seem to be the argument, or was meant to be, as though stooping to civility might implicate one in the idiocy of the other side. Yes, if the atheists can control themselves and not act outraged and not act furious to the point of empurplement, cannot act dehumanizing, cannot act disrespectful, then they would seem like the pushover wimpy Christian that they're trying to make the Christian out to be. They're trying to make themselves out to be the superior scientific intellectual side, and they're trying to make out the Christian to be the stupid person who believes in fairy tales. But all religions are not equal. They're not. And even atheism is a religion, despite the claims. So the single argument or thesis, really, that the new atheists hammered almost to the point of excluding others was that all religions are fundamentally irrational, while science and atheism are rational. And since all religions are utterly irrational, all religions are therefore equally evil, say the atheists. But did even they themselves believe what they were saying? Did they mean to put the Christian faith of Dr. Martin Luther King and Mother Teresa equal with the religious animist cults that sacrificed human beings to appease nature gods and guarantee good crops? Are they gonna say that people like Martin Luther King and Mother Teresa were irrational and evil? Surely they wouldn't say something like that. That would get people to stop listening to them if they made claims like that. But yet that is the essence of what they're saying. If they're going to be consistent, they're going to have to say that Martin Luther King and Mother Teresa are evil if they're going to be consistent. Did they believe William Wilburforce should have kept his religion to himself and not argued for an end to the slave trade in the British Empire? Should William Wilburforce, the Christian, have argued to stop slavery? Wilburforce believed the Bible was clear that all were equal in God's eyes and commanded to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. Did they wish to denounce that and the abolitionist efforts that sprang therefrom? Did the atheists wish to denounce the abolitionist efforts that the Christians spearheaded? Or could they really believe that the heroic and brilliant Dietrich Bonhoeffer went to the gallows for nothing? That is speaking up against Hitler and for the Jews of Europe because his faith led him to do this was foolish and impractical and he should have minded his own business? Surely they would have approved of somebody like Dietrich Bonhoeffer trying to put an end to Nazi Germany through his efforts to at least have a positive influence in that horrific environment. Wilburforce and Bonhoeffer and Dr. King and Mother Teresa all come to mind when we think of people of faith led in their courageous efforts by the God they believed that created them. That the new atheists could just wave these heroes away just as they would wave away the devotees of a bloodthirsty human sacrifice cult is obviously absurd. They would lump the likes of Wilberforce, Bonhoeffer, King, and Teresa in with the bloodthirsty human sacrifice cult is obviously absurd. But when you hear them talk, that's what they do. Nonetheless, they did their best to maintain this manifestly irrational posture, all the while shouting that they alone were devoted to rationality, while all religious were inherently irrational. It was lamentably rare that they were called out on this childishness. But while Hitchens was promoting his book on the Charlie Rose program on PBS, the host asked about Bonhoeffer, whom most would rightly regard as a great hero of Christian faith in action at the cost of his life. Hitchens didn't miss a beat, actually claiming Bonhoeffer was not a Christian at all, but a humanist, whatever that might mean. In any case, it was nonsense, but Charlie Rose did not feel up to countering it, and the bold lie by Hitchens was allowed to stand. Another word must be said on the new atheists' insistence that they stand for reason and rationality. To claim that one is pro-reason is a nice beginning, but you've only described the system you hope to use going forward. It's like saying you're pro-math, but you never go on to solve any math problem. You just talk about math. yes, the atheist likes to say they're pro-reason and pro-rationality. But the reason that they use is so flawed that they're not solving any problems. Their rationality is so irrational that it's creating more problems than it's solving. But they're talking about reason and rationality. In the conversations that I've heard Sam Harris do, he's really talking about reason and rationality. And every time he speaks about those things, I just have to chuckle or gag, because what he says is the opposite of reason and rationality from everything that I've heard him say. And I've heard him in conversations with Jordan Peterson, at least that. Being for logic and principle isn't worth much if you cannot be logical in practice. And in their arguments and debates in books, they were not logical in practice or principle. When math and science and rationality put a man on the moon and bring him back to Earth safely, we applaud. These things have done something beyond themselves. But when someone's whole argument is that they are for reason and against those who are against it, they have gotten nowhere. Nor did we ever get to hear what they were promoting as a replacement for what they were insisting must be raised. In the end, they were promoting absolutely nothing, if not actual nothingness itself, even nihilism. Now we're going to question questions and doubt doubts. Another argument these horsemen put forward was that religion is evil because all who profess belief in God are strident and unyielding and dogmatic, as though everyone who believed in God were a sword-wielding member of the Taliban, longing for a violent theocracy, and in the meantime vigorously sniffing out other people's sins in order to condemn them, and then decapitating and defenestrating or otherwise punishing those who had committed them. Had none of them ever really visited a soup kitchen? Yeah, at least in the Christian faith, you've got lots of people who, I mean, the New Testament says that the Christian is to be zealous for good works. That an atheist cannot be zealous for good works or cannot do good works. Not saying that. But they're saying that the new atheist is saying that the Christian is they're overemphasizing the works done by religious people of religion, and they are taking those negative works and they are making those so dominant over the good works that are part and parcel of the Christian religion, and throwing the baby in the bathwater both out without investigating the complete evidence for the Christian faith. And some of them, even if they do investigate the complete evidence for the Christian faith, they maintain their atheism because they are so blinded by hatred. They're so blinded by hatred, and they have emotional bias against the God of the Bible and the people who believe in the God of the Bible. It prevents them from humbling themselves, admitting the error of their ways, and coming to saving faith. And so, to make them feel better about themselves, and to try to recruit members to their team, they invent caricatures of all religion that are hardly ever based on reality, anything remotely close to resembling reality. And they lump everything into that caricature. They call it straw manning. So the caricatures that the new atheists paint of faith were not only tremendously and shamefully dishonest, it's straw manning, but were ultimately and patently ridiculous to most people. Nonetheless, they kept at it. It would go without saying, but of course the most profound Christians in history have often had deep questions about the faith they proclaim, and for which many of them died. Yes, just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you think you have all the answers, and if you're a Christian and you do think you have all the answers, that's a problem. Because there's always room for growth, and there's always room for knowledge, and there's always studying to be done. So the idea that having questions or doubts negates faith in God and the Bible is hardly logical. One might even say that the closer one comes to knowing God, the more questions one has. Faith and questions are not at all mutually exclusive, and for that matter, don't we all have questions about science? After all, it has failed us so many times. But yet the atheists will continue to put their faith in science, and they'll keep saying, just give us more time. More time, more time, more time. For decades, scientists and the scientific establishment insisted on something without giving any quarter to those on the other side, until we later realized their view was quite wrong. But we don't throw science out as a result of these errors. We understand that there can be misunderstandings and that people are often loath to change to a new paradigm. But we have enough faith in the idea of scientific inquiry to stick with it, even when it sometimes leads us astray, and even when it is sheer ideology that is merely hiding under the aegis of scientific inquiry. We all live in these tensions, but the new atheists were not large enough to contain such multitudes and likely would burst at the seams for trying, so they simply persisted in taking potshots at God and at faith, and seemingly only to want to confuse their readers and listeners toward assent with their grim conclusions. But they could not do so with real arguments, so instead employed rhetorical techniques. Their persistence in this forensic dishonesty eventually helped many people cease to take them very seriously, because in the end they seemed to have no governing principles and were only taking advantage of those of us who did. If only one player thinks cheating is permissible, then the contest will not be very robust. But we should ask ourselves, why did we ever expect people who genuinely believed in nothing to have governing principles? Yes, why should the atheists have governing principles? They don't believe in anything, so why should they have governing principles? On what basis would they have governing principles? Of course, they eschewed revealing their revulsion toward governing principles and continued to pretend they had them, but they would unhelpfully volunteer that they were adamantly opposed to unreason and irrationality, even as they were themselves being unreasonable and irrational. Atheists often express a bitterness and an anger, and that inevitably appears to belie their declared stance of impartial rationality. Many persecuted Christians, on the other hand, including many who were martyred, expressed an indefatigable and seemingly inexplicable joy. Let's start there. So if life is meaningless, why rage against those who find meaning in life from God? Most of these polemical atheists seem to be bitter at the state of the world, or at the religious believers whom they blame for the state of the world, as though their inane and irrational beliefs were the only thing standing between mankind and utopia. But even if this were true, is it not logical to ask why a true atheist should protest anything at all? Because if there really is no God, then it surely follows that there's no order or meaning in the universe. We're all accidental excrescences who bear no inherent value and have no transcendent purpose. If this is true, by what standard could an atheist claim one way of being any better than another? Yeah, if there is, like, when I hear people like, I mean, recently I listened to a little bit of Sam Harris, so he's the one that comes to mind. But they all say similar things. But when they say, when they make moral claims, such as talking about something being better or more rational, on whose standard are you getting that from? You're inventing an absolute standard that has no foundation on your worldview. Or if there is a standard on your worldview, it's always changing. The goalpost is always shifting because it is subjective in Christianity, on the other hand, you have an absolute standard that's unchanging. And yes, there are some atrocities that are done in the name of religion. And the next chapter in this book, Is Atheism Dead, brilliantly responds to some of those things. And I look forward to going through that in a subsequent video. And given the fundamental meaninglessness of life that atheists have to admit there is, why bother trying so hard to change things anyway? Why work at making life better for yourself or for others if it's all meaningless? If all our lives have no more meaning than the life of a gnat or a blade of desert grass in the middle of a vast wasteland, there's the gnat, there's the grass, or a scorpion. If our lives are no more meaningful than the gnat, the blade of grass, or the scorpion, or a grub, there's the grub, under the leaves of a forest floor 1,000 miles from any road, if our lives don't mean anything more than any of the lives of those things, why does it matter? Why does any of it matter? Certainly they must see that according to their doctrine, the length of our lives or the size of our brains does not change the meaninglessness of our existence. If there's no meaning to life, why spend so much time like they do trying to convince people that there's no meaning by embracing their worldview? What is the benefit of that? Pascal's wager says that life has meaning. Give your life to God, and you will reap the benefit in the end. That is the wager. If you give your life to God, you will find the meaning in the end. Maybe that's a misrepresentation of Pascal's wager. I'm not trying to misrepresent it, but that's what comes to mind. So if they protest on this somehow, saying that yes, but we are here now and we must make the best of it, we must still ask why. Why do we need to make the best of it? Why does it matter? On what basis must we make the best of it? And if in a few decades we'll all be as non-existent as the ant that scrambles along my windowsill will be in 2 years, non-existent as the ant in 2 years, or in 5 seconds if I decide to crush him, why should we attend to these lives we are leading now in any way at all? Most of us on the planet feel that we should, of course, but isn't that view in perfect contradiction with the atheist doctrine? Yeah, most of us feel like we should attend to the lives that we're leading now. Why? If there is no God, if there is no ultimate purpose or meaning, what's the point? I guess if you're an atheist, you could say, just for your own personal pleasure, get as much pleasure as you can in this life, because that's all that you have is this life. So you might as well just fill it up with as much pleasure as you can. That might be a response. Don't the rest of us feel we should take the responsibilities that we have, because we have a sense that there's more to everything than mere matter? We should live our best life, not in the Osteen way, but we should live our best life because that's what God would want us to do, because we are more than just matter. Our lives have inherent purpose and extraordinary value, even if we can't say exactly how or why this is. Yes, if you're a theist, if you are operating on a theistic worldview, on a Christian worldview, you know your life has inherent purpose and extraordinary value. But if you don't believe that God does not exist, if you are theistic, you're coming from a theistic presupposition, not even necessarily Christian, you've got to know that there's some purpose or meaning to life, value to life. That our lives, so don't the rest of us feel we should have a sense that there is more to everything than mere matter, that our lives have inherent purpose, extraordinary value, even if we can't say exactly how or why this is. The inability of atheists to consistently live out their views is the first and most powerful argument against their views. But isn't the essentially universal feeling that we should all do what we can to make things better the best evidence that real atheism is a practical impossibility? That it's only something that could have been dreamed up by people whose lives really do have intrinsic meaning, even if they cannot understand how that is? If there's no creator and our lives are perfectly accidental, why should we logically care about anything more than a worm cares about, or a piece of lichen? Hundreds of millions of years pass in which worms and lichens don't exist, and then at some point they exist, and as soon as they cease to exist, and another several hundreds of millions of years pass in which they don't exist and never will exist again. What of it? If that's not our story, is that not our story according to the atheist doctrine? That for hundreds of millions of years we didn't exist, and then we did exist for a little blip, and then we never will exist again? So in other words, we're not valuable, we don't matter. We're just, as Durbin says, we're just stardust. That's such a depressing doctrine. But yet that's the atheist doctrine. But is there a soul on the planet who actually believes that and lives as though that's true? And obviously, these vocal atheists, they don't live as though it's true, because if they really did believe it's true, who cares what everyone believes? They've found their meaning in not atheism. So just let them have their way. But they don't want to do that. They want to delude people into rejecting the one true God, the God of the Bible. And they think, and they must feel accomplished in doing so. So how then is all the debating and writing these atheists do anything but self-evidently meaningless? Exactly. If this life is all there is, then what's the point of going to all this trouble to convince everybody that this life is all there is? It's just meaningless. And they cannot see that all of the debating and writing, that all can they not see that all the debating and writing those of us who believe our lives have meaning do, and that a God who is perfect love created us in his own image and longs for us to exist with him in a state of bliss for eternity, is an effort we understand to be worth making? So we believers who believe that our lives do have meaning, we understand that showing others that their lives can have meaning too, through a relationship with the God of the Bible, who is perfect love, who created us in his own image and longs for us to exist with him in a state of bliss for eternity. That's an effort that's worth making for us. This alone is the most curious of all questions. To what end precisely do Christopher Hitchens and his fellow atheists rail and rage? It is the ghastly conundrum at the heart of all the atheists say, and they cannot explain their way out of it. So they run away from it, via clever rejoinders and sudden shifts to other subjects. According to his own beliefs, Christopher Hitchens is as non-existent now as he was before the planets formed. What drove him to bother as he did, to expend himself so mightily, what drove him to bother as he did, to expend himself so mightily, except an internal contradiction that he defiantly refused to acknowledge about what he so histrionically claimed to believe? Exactly. If it doesn't matter, why go to all the trouble to convince people? By his doctrine, putting a bullet in his own putting a bullet in his own heart and in the heads of anyone he knew to be suffering was by far a more logical way of dealing with the problems of the world. So why didn't he? Is it because there were undeniable things inside him that made him know this was wrong, even though he couldn't philosophically support those knowings, and therefore either assiduously avoided thinking or speaking of them, or else manufactured logical workarounds, which he assumed those on his side would support because they did see the illogic of them? Did Hitchens refuse to publicly acknowledge these contradictions because he knew that with the end of joy of pretending to fight for something that mattered, that would jerk his fun run to a dead stop at the end of logic's unforgiving leash? Yeah, he's there's no point fighting the atheist fight because life is meaningless anyway. You're trying to convince people that life has no meaning. What a sad thing to take up. Why are so many militant atheists unwilling to step back and see the bigger picture as many agnostics do? Now we're going to look at agnosticism. The reason doctrinaire atheists like Hitchens and Dawkins blurt the word reason every 12 syllables may simply be to distract us from the inescapable fact that they are themselves being unreasonable and illogical. They won't acknowledge it, but they surely must know it. After all, one can never logically prove there is nothing beyond the world of matter, but one certainly can say one doesn't know or isn't sure and is therefore not an atheist, but an agnostic. Agnosticism can be perfectly logical. We can have questions. We can wonder at much of what the Bible says, not understanding or agreeing with it. But to leap from this to that, to the idea that we can know that there is no God and can say that belief in God in the Bible is irrational, is itself irrational. The only conclusion we can draw from a stance of unyielding atheism is that atheists are so unaccountably tortured by even the possibility that there might be a God that they cannot so much as admit the possibility. And this, of course, is the reason behind their flight from reason and their wild insistence that only they are. Because of what must we assume? Because of what must we assume is their anger at God, because that's how it comes across, despite their protestations, or perhaps because of their protestations and their anger at the loathsome ninnies who believe in God. Because of their anger at God, they must simply insist that God does not exist, even though they must abandon reason to arrive at the conclusion that he doesn't exist. So to demonstrate this anger at God, they protest and attack those who do believe and belittle those who do believe in God. They refuse to be open-minded and genuinely inquisitive and will belittle and bully their opponents into silence if that is the only way forward in their crusade. And is it not perfectly ironic and curiously fitting that those who denounce people of faith as dogmatic moralists themselves are the fiercest bullies and ideological prigs? And I've been known to be a bully in arguing for the faith before, and the Lord has shown me that, and I'm working to make changes in that area. Their unwillingness even to tolerate dissent would be almost comical, were it not so genuinely sad. Once we leave the heat of the debate and think of their strange and untenable position, and were it not somewhat frightening too, since we know where such atheist intolerance has often ended, historically speaking. The Welsh poet Dylan Thomas is a good example of a genuine agnostic. He seemed not to believe there was a God, but continually wrestled with all the evidence that there might be a God, or even must be a God. So rather than being insufferably dogmatic, he and his poems come across as genuine and vulnerable and honest. He wrestled with the tension between a world that often seemed bereft of God and that nonetheless also often seems somehow, if only obliquely, to point to God. His father was bitterly and vocally atheistic, but his mother was a church-going believer, and Thomas seems in his capacious soul to have had room for elements of both views. The famous villanelle in which he writes of watching his dying father slipping into the darkness of a bleak eternity is probably the best known of all his poems. Quote, "Do not go gentle into that good night," he writes. "Rage, rage against the dying of the light." End quote. He seems to say that even if you think you're sliding down into nothingness, you ought to nonetheless fight against it all the way with all your might and main. Do not accept it, but rage with every last breath and calorie of energy against it. But why? The only answer must be that Thomas somehow instinctively understood that there was something in our lives that was extraordinary and inestimably valuable, no matter what evidence there seemed to be to the contrary. He wrote about this contrary evidence too, but in this poem, one of the most touching and famous of the century, he seems to say that there is something something of infinite value that we sense is worth fighting for, despite whatever evidence there might be to the contrary. Our lives could not merely be something temporary to be sloughed off, nor could fatalistically resigning ourselves to the darkness and nothingness be the right way. This instinct on his part toward hope, despite all, was itself a bright blaze on the trail toward meaning and truth, and probably toward God too. Thomas's was no easy doctrine, and he so brilliantly worked out his struggles on these issues in verse for years for all the world to see. He could not shrink from the contradictory evidence, but neither was he ever foolish enough to try to build a philosophy out of it, or an anti-religion either, for somehow he knew that was impossible. Those like Thomas, for whom faith did not come easily or at all, but who dared to face the difficulties of the larger question, deserve our admiration and gratitude, if only for their honesty. Yes, Thomas it's burdening him, and he's expressing the burden. On the other hand, you have Four Horsemen up there who aren't even giving it a chance. They don't want to because they don't want to be accountable. To acknowledge God means to acknowledge accountability to God. And accountability to God means he's a judge. And if he's a judge, we're going to have to admit that we've done wrong, and we don't want to do that. We're okay with him judging other people. We don't want him judging us. Not everyone has a clear revelation of God and truth sufficient to end their doubts. And so we return to the unhelpful raging against the light itself that we see in Hitchens and his friends. It's simply not logical that any of them could believe what they purport to believe, because to believe it and live out that belief would be a logical absurdity and an impossibility, a snake swallowing its own tail. Any of us who truly wishes to believe that there is no God cannot fully do so. To pretend that we emerged from nothing and go toward nothing is untenable. People who know God exists know that when he created us in his image, he made us long for meaning. And there can be no escaping that, however we wish to try. We may twist away from the truth, but there is a gyroscope in every atom of our being that works against such twisting, that forces us to be righted and to yearn for light and meaning and truth and goodness. And with irony magnificently lost on them, these atheists betray this very fact in the writing of their books and their other advocacy for their position. Because, as we have said, if there is no God and life is meaningless, why say anything at all? Exactly. Why bother? Why make the effort to convince anyone of anything if those to whom you are talking are not more than bugs or stones or tumbleweeds? Right, because the human is created in God's image. They are greater than the bugs or stones or tumbleweeds. And yet these atheist authors cannot help themselves. They write and try to convince others, but according to everything they seem to say in so doing, these very activities are meaningless and chasing after the wind. That is the end of chapter 19 of Is Atheism Dead by Metaxas. Next time, we'll hit chapter 20, Is Atheism Evil? And at the time of this recording, I'm still writing the slides for chapter 20, and I have found this chapter to be amazing, chapter 20 to be amazing. I mean, this book is amazing, but this chapter in particular, pointing out, the atheist is real quick to point out the quote unquote atrocities done in the name of the God of the Bible, in the name of Christianity. And this next chapter, Metaxas is going to go into some of the atrocities that have been perpetuated by atheist regimes. And I had no idea about some of the stuff I was reading. We've heard of Stalin, we've heard of Hitler, and most of us have revulsion toward Nazi Germany and the acts that were perpetuated there. And Metaxas is going to make the case that it's the atheistic worldview that's undergirding that, and there's going to be some information to back that up. So please be on the lookout for that. Thank you for tuning in. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.